The city buzzed with life. The streets were bathed in bright daylight, and the constant rush of people filled the air with a chaotic symphony of footsteps, distant honks, and murmured conversations. Everyone seemed preoccupied, lost in their own little worlds, until an unmistakable sound broke through the usual din, a loud, angry voice. "Hey, yeah." The voice came from a man standing near a street vendor, dressed in a crumpled leather jacket and faded jeans. His face twisted into a sneer, his tone dripping with contempt. The target of his outburst was a tall, well-dressed black man walking with a purposeful stride. The man, holding a sleek leather briefcase, paused mid-step. His calm, composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the venom directed his way. Slowly, he turned to face the aggressor. "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place?" The man in the leather jacket spat, his voice growing louder. "You don't belong here. People like you never did." The black man stood silently, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. The street, alive with motion just moments ago, seemed to freeze. Pedestrians slowed their steps, their heads turning toward the confrontation. Some stopped entirely, forming an unspoken circle around the two men. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. No one dared to intervene, yet all eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding before them. The aggressor took a step closer, emboldened by the lack of resistance. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he sneered, his voice laced with mockery. "Or are you just too stupid to say something back?" Still, the black man didn't react. His silence only seemed to fuel the aggressor's rage. "That's right," the man continued, his voice rising. "You know your place, don't you? Down there, beneath the rest of us. That's where you've always been, and that's where you'll stay." A faint murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others pulled out their phones, the screens lighting up as they began recording. The tension in the air was palpable, like a tightly wound wire about to snap. Finally, the black man took a deliberate step forward. His movements were calm, measured. His gaze never wavered as he locked eyes with the man before him. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried the weight of authority. "I'm silent," he said, his tone steady, "because your words aren't worth responding to." The crowd fell into stunned silence. The words cut through the air like a blade, their quiet power leaving an undeniable impact. For a fleeting moment, even the aggressor seemed caught off guard. His sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. But he quickly recovered, doubling down with a louder, harsher tone, as though volume alone could restore his dominance. "You think you're better than me, huh?" he barked, his voice tinged with desperation. "You're nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." From the crowd came a sudden voice, loud and sharp. "Enough." It was a middle-aged woman, her face flushed with anger. She stepped forward, positioning herself between the two men. "Leave him alone," she demanded, her voice unwavering. Her intervention was like a signal. One by one, others began stepping forward. "Yeah, cut it out," shouted a young man holding a skateboard. "This isn't right," added an older gentleman, shaking his head in disapproval. The aggressor looked around, his confidence visibly crumbling as the crowd turned against him. What had started as a one-sided display of hatred was now spiraling out of his control. "Who do you think you are?" someone in the crowd called out. "People like you are the problem," another voice added, growing louder with every word. Then came the unmistakable sound of a phone camera clicking. The aggressor turned sharply, his face pale. Several people were filming him now, their phones raised like silent witnesses. "You want to keep talking?" asked a man holding his phone steady. Go on, let the whole world see who you are. The aggressor's eyes darted around, his earlier bravado replaced by sheer panic. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The black man, still composed, took another step forward. His gaze never left the aggressor's face. You've already said enough, he stated firmly. His voice was calm but carried an unshakable finality. Your actions have spoken for you. With that, he turned and began to walk away. The crowd parted for him, some clapping, others calling out words of support. The aggressor stood frozen, his face flushed with shame and humiliation. The phones remained trained on him, capturing every moment of his disgrace. He tried to shrink away, but there was nowhere to hide. By the time the crowd dispersed, the man in the leather jacket was left standing alone. His heart pounded as he realized the full weight of what had just happened. The faces of those who had watched, judged, and condemned him burned in his memory. As he stumbled away, the unmistakable thought clawed at his mind. The videos would spread. His face, his words, his hatred, everything was now public. There would be no escaping the consequences. The morning after the incident, the city awoke to an entirely new kind of energy. The usual hum of cars and distant chatter was replaced by the sharp trill of phone notifications and the whirl of viral videos spreading like wildfire. Overnight, a single moment had captured the attention of thousands and soon millions. Ethan Harris had no idea what was coming for him. As sunlight poured through his bedroom window, his phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand. With a groggy hand, he reached for it, already annoyed. As he squinted at the screen, he noticed dozens of missed calls and countless messages. The notifications were relentless: texts, emails, and mentions on social media. Hey, is this you? You disgust me. Get ready for your life to be over. Confused and uneasy, Ethan clicked on one of the links in a message. His face drained of color as he watched the now viral video of himself on the street. There he was, shouting and sneering, his voice venomous. Who do you think you are? You're nothing. The camera captured everything, the anger twisting his face, the stunned silence of the crowd, and most damning of all, the black man's calm yet devastating reply. I'm silent because your words aren't worth responding to. The video ended with Ethan's face frozen in rage, followed by the murmur of the crowd, their disdain unmistakable. Heart pounding, he scrolled down to the comments. This man is vile. Find out who he is. I hope he loses everything. What a perfect example of hate being exposed. He dropped the phone as though it had burned him. His mind raced. How had this spread so fast? The phone buzzed again, a sharp interruption to his spiraling thoughts. The caller ID flashed with a name he couldn't avoid, his boss. Ethan, the voice on the other end was cold, clipped, and professional. I've seen the video. So has the board. Wait, Ethan stammered, his throat dry. I can explain. No explanation is necessary, the boss interrupted, his tone devoid of emotion. This kind of behavior doesn't align with our company's values. Effective immediately, you're terminated. HR will contact you about your severance. The call ended before Ethan could respond. His phone slipped from his hands onto the bed. Fired. Just like that. The situation escalated quickly. By midday, Ethan's name and address were leaked online. The comments turned from virtual outrage to something far more tangible. You're a dead man walking. Someone should teach him a lesson. Here's his house. Go make him pay. From his living room window, Ethan noticed a small group gathering near his driveway, some holding their phones, filming his home. His chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on his back. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar: fear. He yanked the curtains shut and stumbled back into the kitchen. Gripping the edge of the counter, he tried to catch his breath. The phone wouldn't stop buzzing. He ignored most of the calls until one name appeared: his sister. Hesitant, he picked up. "What did you do, Ethan?" Her voice was sharp, bordering on panicked. "Do you have any idea what's happening?" "Mom saw the video. She's ashamed. Everyone in the family is ashamed." "Don't lecture me," he snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. "Don't lecture you," she retorted. "Your face is everywhere. You've ruined yourself. I hope it was worth it." The line went dead. Ethan dropped the phone onto the counter. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hands trembling. As the day faded into evening, Ethan's face was plastered across every social media platform. News outlets began picking up the story. Headlines condemned him with brutal efficiency. Racist tirade captured on video. The internet responds. Man faces backlash after publicly humiliating black professional. Racist rant costs local man his job and reputation. Ethan's attempts at damage control fell flat. He typed out a lengthy apology and posted it on his social media accounts. "I deeply regret my actions yesterday. I let my emotions get the better of me and said things that do not reflect who I am. I am truly sorry." The response was swift and merciless. "This isn't regret, it's panic. Apologizing because you got caught doesn't count. You showed us exactly who you are." Ethan closed his laptop, feeling trapped. The walls of his home seemed to close in on him. Outside, the faint sound of voices carried through the air. He peeked through the blinds and saw more people gathering, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. The silence in his house was suffocating, but his thoughts were louder than any noise. Every word he had shouted at the man on the street came rushing back, distorted and amplified in his mind. He saw the man's calm face again, staring back at him, unshaken. In another part of the city, the black man sat alone in his modest apartment. His phone buzzed with messages, words of encouragement, praise for his composure, and requests for interviews. He ignored most of them, exhausted by the unwanted attention. All he wanted was to move on, but the world wouldn't let him. His image had become a symbol, a rallying point. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window, wondering why the weight of another man's hate had been placed on his shoulders. Ethan, meanwhile, sat in the dim light of his living room, clutching his empty glass. He had never felt so alone. The night that followed was one of torment for Ethan. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see his own face twisted with hate, the venom in his voice echoing through his mind. But what haunted him most was the calm response from the black man. The way he had stood there, unwavering, with a quiet strength that seemed to pierce through Ethan's bravado like a sharp blade. The silence that followed Ethan's outburst, the subtle yet powerful dignity of the other man, rattled him to his core. The morning brought no relief. Ethan woke with the familiar buzz of his phone next to him, a cruel reminder that the world hadn't stopped turning because of his shame. The same videos, now shared by millions, played over and over in his notifications. His face, sneering, arrogant, full of hatred, flashed across the screen again and again. The worst part was the public nature of his downfall. People from all over were sharing the video, discussing his behavior, and giving their opinions. Ethan had never been so exposed. He felt like every corner of the city was pointing at him, judging him, mocking him. His anger was now mixed with humiliation, and the feeling of being hunted pressed down on him with every passing moment. By mid-afternoon, The messages had started to take a darker turn. Ethan scrolled through his phone, his hands shaking as he read. "You're going to regret what you did. Hope you like the attention, because it's about to get worse. You won't escape this. We'll make sure everyone knows who you really are." His throat tightened. He tried to ignore them, but the dread in his chest was impossible to ignore. Every ping of his phone felt like a warning, a reminder that he couldn't hide from the consequences of his actions. As he looked out the window, he saw more people gathering near his house, taking pictures and filming him from a distance. He hadn't left the house since the morning. He couldn't. It felt as though the entire world was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. Then his phone rang again. This time, it was from an unknown number. Ethan hesitated before answering. "Hello," he said, his voice shaky. "Ethan Harris?" A deep voice on the other end asked. "Yeah, who is this?" Ethan replied, anxiety creeping into his voice. "I'm Detective Markham. I need you to come down to the station. We've received multiple threats against your life, and we need to discuss your safety." Ethan's heart dropped. Threats? Against his life? His hands went clammy, and he could feel the walls of his house closing in around him. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Ethan stammered. "I'm sorry. I didn't think it would get so out of hand." "We're not here to talk about your apology," the detective interrupted, his tone firm. "I need you here." Now, the call ended abruptly, and Ethan stood frozen, his mind reeling. He had never been in trouble like this before. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. He didn't even know where to go or what to do next. All he wanted was to disappear. As Ethan drove to the police station, the weight of the situation continued to press down on him. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every car that passed by seemed to be looking at him, judging him. He couldn't escape it. Even the people on the street seemed to stare, their eyes piercing through his car window, as though they knew exactly who he was. When he arrived at the station, he was escorted into a small interrogation room. The detective, a tall man with a grim expression, sat across from him, watching him closely. "I'm not here to accuse you of anything, Mr. Harris," the detective said, his voice calm, but there was a coldness to it. "But you've stirred up quite a storm. People are angry, and they're not letting you off easy. We've already received dozens of threats directed at you. People want justice?" "I never wanted any of this to happen," Ethan muttered, his voice trembling. He could barely meet the detective's eyes. I just lost control. I said some things I didn't mean." "You can't take those words back," the detective said, his tone hardening. "And you can't hide from the consequences. The video's everywhere. People are demanding answers. They want to know what kind of man would say those things publicly. And they're not satisfied with your apology. They want something more. They want you to pay for what you did." Ethan felt his chest tighten. The pressure was unbearable. The detective's words were like a hammer, each strike driving home the gravity of his actions. He had underestimated everything: the power of social media, the anger of the public, the way his words could reverberate long after the incident. "Do you think you deserve forgiveness?" the detective asked, his eyes narrowing. Ethan froze, caught off guard by the question. He hadn't even thought about forgiveness. All he wanted was to escape the consequences. But deep down, he knew that forgiveness wasn't something he could just expect. He had caused harm, and now he had to face it. "I don't know," Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know who I am anymore." The detective sighed, his expression softening slightly. "That's something you'll need to figure out for yourself, Mr. Harris. But just remember, Whatever happens next, you can't undo what you've done. You have to live with it. The door to the room opened, and a uniformed officer stepped inside. "Detective, we've got a situation," the officer said, glancing at Ethan. "There's a crowd outside. They're calling for him. They want him to answer for what he did." Ethan's blood ran cold. A crowd? Outside the police station? The detective stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He motioned for Ethan to follow him. As they walked through the station's corridors, Ethan could hear the growing noise from outside, the sound of chanting, shouting, and the unmistakable roar of an angry crowd. He felt the walls closing in again. This was it. The moment where there was no turning back. The air outside the police station was thick with tension. As Ethan stepped into the bright, fluorescent-lit hallway, the sound of the crowd grew louder, more frantic. Every step he took seemed to reverberate in his chest, as though the noise from outside was pressing in on him, suffocating him. The weight of what was happening was suffocating, and he couldn't escape it. The detective, still silent, led him through the back exits of the station, but Ethan could hear the angry chants growing closer, reverberating off the walls. "You can't hide, Harris," someone yelled from the crowd. The voice was muffled by the thick walls, but the fury was unmistakable. The sound of shouting made Ethan's heart race. He wanted to turn around, to retreat back into the relative safety of the station, but the crowd was closing in. His entire body was on edge as they reached a side door, the heat from outside instantly pressing against him as the detective swung it open. "We need to get you out of here now," the detective said, his voice low and urgent. "There's no time to waste. They're already waiting for you out front." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had become a symbol now, a symbol of everything that people despised, everything they wanted to tear down. His outburst, his hate, it was all out there in the open. No amount of apologies, no amount of regret could change what had already been done. "Where will I go?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper, his chest tightening. "I can't stay here. They'll find me." The detective gave him a grim look. "We're taking you somewhere safe for now. You're going to have to lay low until this all settles down." But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. The world felt like it was closing in on him. The detective led him through an alley and toward a black SUV parked out of sight from the growing crowd. Ethan climbed inside, his hands still shaking, as the detective slammed the door shut behind him. As they sped away from the station, Ethan couldn't help but look out the rear window, watching the distant figure of the crowd still growing, a swarm of people moving like a tidal wave, relentlessly pushing forward. His stomach churned. Every step they took, every move he made now felt like part of an endless cycle. The anger, the judgment, it was all closing in. The SUV weaved through the narrow streets, each turn seeming to take Ethan further away from any semblance of control. He felt trapped, like a caged animal being led somewhere he didn't want to go. The detective remained silent beside him, his expression hard to read. The tension was palpable in the air between them. After what felt like an eternity of driving, the SUV slowed down, and the detective looked at him. "We're taking you to a safe house for the time being. You need to lay low. The media frenzy isn't going to calm down anytime soon, and your life is in danger." The word danger hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had never been a person who worried about his safety, but now, in this moment, with the weight of his own actions pressing down on him, he understood. The world was angry, and they were waiting for him to slip. Hours passed, and Ethan found himself in an old, run-down house on the outskirts of the city, far from his former life. It was a small, unimpressive place, far removed from the comfort of his previous existence. The detective had left him alone, saying he would check in later. Ethan tried to collect his thoughts, but it was impossible. The phone calls, the messages, the threats, it was all too much. He opened his phone, unable to resist the temptation to check his social media again, but as soon as he did, a flood of new notifications greeted him. They had only gotten worse. Someone's going to make him pay for this. Ethan Harris should rot in prison. Hope you like living in fear. He scrolled through the posts, his heart sinking with every word. People had started to call for more than just his professional downfall. They wanted retribution. They wanted him to be held accountable in ways far darker than just losing his job or being publicly shamed. As Ethan sat in the silence of the safe house, a knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. His pulse spiked. He hadn't expected anyone. He quickly stood, his feet unsteady as he moved toward the door. His mind raced, but before he could even reach the handle, the door was pushed open from the outside. The detective stood in the doorway, his face grave. Behind him, a few officers stood as well. The tension in the air was palpable. Ethan could see the unease on their faces, the way their hands hovered near their weapons, as though anticipating danger. "Detective?" Ethan asked, his voice unsteady. "We've got a situation," the detective said bluntly. "The crowd outside the police station has only gotten bigger. They're demanding answers. We've seen more threats on your life. It's not just online anymore. People know where you are, and they're coming for you." Ethan's blood ran cold. He was running out of time. Running out of places to hide. He had always thought of himself as someone who could handle things, but this was different. This was a storm, one he couldn't outrun. "I didn't mean to," Ethan started, his voice thick with the panic rising in his chest. The detective cut him off with a harsh shake of his head. "It doesn't matter what you meant anymore. The world's already decided. You're going to have to deal with the fallout." The door slammed shut behind him as the detective motioned for Ethan to follow. As they rushed through the back halls of the safe house, Ethan's mind spun. How had everything unraveled so quickly? One moment he had been living his normal life, and the next he was a public enemy, marked by his own words, by his own hatred. And now he was being hunted. They reached a back exit where an unmarked van waited, its engine running. The detective opened the door, and as Ethan climbed inside, he could hear the distant sound of voices, angry, raucous, and closing in. The crowd was relentless. They weren't going to let him go. Ethan's heart pounded as the van pulled away, but even as they sped down the empty streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that the crowd wasn't just a physical threat. They were a symbol of something far larger. His actions had awakened something dark in the world, something unforgiving, something that would follow him no matter where he ran. The weight of his own choices pressed down harder with every passing second, and as the van disappeared into the night, Ethan knew this was just the beginning. Ethan sat in the dark room, his eyes closed, his heart pounding. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about what he had become. The curses and insults he had screamed at the man on the street now echoed in his mind like sounds from hell. He had become what everyone hated. He had dug his own grave. It had been days since Ethan left the police station, and now he found himself holed up in a forgotten corner of the city. His life had changed. The moment he realized that he had become a target of hate and condemnation, his reality shattered like glass. Even simple trips to the store had turned into a trial. He could see people turning their heads, looking at him with judgment or fear in their eyes. The faces of his former friends no longer held the warmth they once did. Their gazes were cold, distant. With each passing day, things got worse. New videos flooded social media, linking his name with anger and violence. Countries, cities, streets, people from all over the world now knew his name. His face was everywhere. Ethan understood that his life was ruined. But the worst part wasn't losing his job or being ostracized. The worst part was that his words, his actions, continued to live on in the minds of everyone. That night, as Ethan sat in his hidden refuge, his phone rang again. He looked at the screen. It was an unfamiliar number. Ethan didn't want to answer, but something inside him wouldn't let him ignore the call. He picked up the phone. "Hello?" His voice sounded hoarse, the weariness of his soul spilling into the words. "Ethan, it's me, Sam." The voice was familiar, but it didn't sound warm like it used to. This was his friend, but now there was something foreign in his voice. "I saw everything that happened. People can't forget. You need to do something. You have to meet him." The word "him" hung in the air. Ethan flinched. "What do you mean?" "You know who I mean. The guy. The man you insulted. You need to meet him and apologize, Ethan. You have to do it. People want to see that you understand what you did. Otherwise, it'll get worse." Ethan went silent, his mind racing. He thought about that moment on the street when he saw the man. He remembered his calm face, full of dignity despite all the insults Ethan had hurled at him. It was as if that man had become a symbol of what Ethan had lost. But meeting him now felt impossible. How could he just walk up to him and say sorry? "You have to do it, Ethan." Sam's voice was insistent. "If you don't, it'll be even worse. You'll lose more than just people. You'll lose yourself." Ethan hung up, his breathing quickening. Sam was right. He knew he couldn't move forward until he faced the man. But how could he even find him? How could he meet him after everything that had happened? The next morning, Ethan decided he had no choice but to find him. He scrolled through news articles, looking for information, trying to locate the man. Hours later, he finally found him. The person he had insulted turned out to be a prominent lawyer, an advocate for black rights. His face was everywhere in the news, on articles, and even protest posters. Ethan felt his stomach drop. His heart raced as he stared at the photo of the man. He had become a symbol of everything Ethan had wronged. His mind spun. What could he even say? How could he apologize for something so much larger than just words? He left the house, his feet heavy with dread. Every step felt like a mile. When he finally arrived at the man's office, his legs were shaking. How could he expect forgiveness? How could he face him after all he had done? Ethan knocked on the door. "Yes?" came the voice from inside. Ethan opened the door. Standing in front of him was the man, the person he had wronged. The man's eyes met his, and for a moment, Ethan felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had never felt so small. The words stuck in his throat. I want to apologize," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "I didn't know what I had caused." The man stood silently, his gaze unwavering. There was no anger, no rage in his eyes. Only silence. Minutes passed before the man finally spoke. "Do you understand what you've done, Ethan? Do you understand how much you've hurt not only me, but so many others?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I know I can't undo what I said," he said, his voice thick with regret. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." The man studied him for a long moment, then spoke again, his voice steady. "Then listen closely, Ethan. You start by understanding the consequences of your words. You will work. You will become part of the solution, not the problem." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this would be hard, that he would have to change so much about himself, about his life. But this was his chance for redemption. He looked at the man in front of him, and despite everything that had happened, he realized that this moment was the first step toward a new life. Looking ahead, Ethan knew the road would be difficult. But he could no longer hide from the consequences of his actions. He knew he would have to do more than just apologize. He would have to actively work to make things right. And perhaps, in doing so, he could finally begin to change not just his life, but the lives of others as well.